Celsus is a key source for understanding second century Christian diversity. He mentions not only Marcelinians, but Christian groups known as Harpocratians, also known as Carpocratians, Marcionites, Valentinians, Simonians, Hellenians, Sibylists, Valentinians, Gnostics, followers of Jewish law and custom, and a group later known as Ophites. Most of these references are very brief. The Sibylists seem to refer only to Christians who interpolated prophecies into the writings of the Sibyl. And Celsus referred to Valentinians as a group who spoke of some Christians as animate and of others as spiritual. Celsus knew of Gnostics or knowers, but he didn't say what they claimed to know, or whether Gnostic was the official name of their group. Perhaps they are the Christians mentioned in 5.65 who have advanced in learning and claim to know more than the Jews. But then again, most Christians, then and now, implicitly claim to know more than the Jews. Celsus has more to say about four distinct groups: the Hellenians, the Marcelinians, the Marcionites, and the Ophites. Since I deal with the Ophites in another module, in this lecture I'll focus on what Celsus can tell us about Hellenians, Marcelinians, and Marcionites. Celsus was familiar with both Simonians, that is, followers of Simon of Samaria, and Hellenians, followers of Simon's partner Helen. In fact, Celsus is the only ancient writer to note that some Simonians were called Hellenians. He knew enough to infer that this name went back to a Simonian teacher, but he didn't know if this teacher was male or female, Helen or Hellenis. Alain Le Bouillec thought that the confusion was part of Celsus's attempt to satirize the Simonians, but Celsus may also simply have been ignorant about Helen and her identity. According to Simonians, Helen represented wisdom, the Greek word here being enia or apenia, divine thought. Far from being lewd or licentious, she was the source of enlightened teaching. Simonians didn't view her, in other words, as Simon's pet, but as an independent instructor in sacred lore. She was a reincarnation of Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman of her time, but the Simonian Helen was known for her intellectual talents. It was thus perfectly understandable that some Simonians were content to be called Hellenians, followers of Helen, their teacher. Marcellina is the only known female leader of a Christian movement in 2nd century CE Alexandria and Rome. She is known primarily through two independent witnesses, the first being Celsus, the second Irenaeus. All other reports about her are derivative. According to Irenaeus, Marcellina was a Carpocratian who came to Rome, probably from Alexandria, in the time of the Christian leader Anicetus, that is between 155 and 166 of the Common Era. She attracted many people to join her movement. Celsus, perhaps mimicking early Catholic criticisms, seems to have referred to Marcellina as a siren. A siren, you'll remember from Homer's Odyssey, is an avian woman who could sing beautifully, but also eat men alive. If Marcellina was called a siren in her day, this was a pejorative way to underscore her persuasive power and possibly her popularity. Celsus also called Marcellina a sophist, a sophistria. This name, the feminine version of sophistes, may have had a negative valence for Celsus, but it also denoted an expert teacher with rhetorical training. Celsus uniquely called Marcellina's group Marcellinians or Marcellinianus. This name indicates a degree of independence from Carpocrates and other Carpocratians. Celsus reported that Salome led the Harpocratians, another term for Carpocratians, while Marcellina led the Marcellinians, with Mary Ami and Martha apparently leading competing groups. Other heresiologists don't mention multiple Carpocratian groups in Rome. If they knew of this kind of intercarpocration competition, they would have underscored their disagreement. Historically, there probably was a single Roman group of Marcellina's followers, a group that emphasized the importance of female apostolic figures like Salome, Mariamne, aka Mary, and Martha. Celsus focused entirely on these female leaders. This point suggests that whoever originally transmitted this information to Celsus had an interest in female leadership among Carpocratians. Perhaps no one was better suited for emphasizing female leadership than Marcellina herself. This inference would indicate that Celsus had done enough research on Marcellina's group to represent her interests in female Christian leadership. What's interesting is that Celsus seems to have put Marcellina on par with more ancient and apostolic women. Marcellina was not, of course, a biblical figure or first generation disciple of Jesus. At the same time, she probably would have benefited from being associated with these first generation disciples, namely Salome, Mary, and Martha. These disciples were not marginal. Salome and Mary, at least, were widely known as recipients of Jesus' secret teaching. We have a Gospel of Mary, and Mary and Martha appear in the later Lucan Gospel, and they in turn became teachers of others in early Christian lore. In this capacity, they filled the role of apostles or apostolic figures in the early church, and here we can compare Junia, the outstanding female apostle in Romans 16:7. If Marcellina highlighted the teaching and apostleship of Salome, Mary, and Martha, she may have put herself in their succession. The idea of apostolic succession was becoming popular up just about this time. It's significant, furthermore, that both Salome and Mary were viewed as champions of asceticism in early gospel literature. Note in particular the Gospel of the Egyptians, preserved mostly by Clement of Alexandria. That is to say, Salome and Mary did not only transmit some of Jesus' private teaching on asceticism, they also modeled it. And if Marcellina did highlight Salome and Mary as apostolic heroes for her church, this is still more evidence that Carpocratians would not have engaged in licentious behavior. Marcellina's higher initiates may have been dubbed firebrands of hearing and Gnostics, which is to say, knowers of spiritual truths. And they received, perhaps from Marcellina herself, a brand mark behind the lobe of their right ear. This is according to Irenaeus. But Celsus is the one who tells us about the firebrands of hearing. Combining these traditions, it seems clear that Marcellina was not only a teacher, but an initiator who promoted distinctive Christian rites and practices. Celsus refers to Marcionites throughout his true Logos. He may have referred to the Marcionite God when he spoke of a quote-unquote different God alien to this cosmos. He referred to Marcionites as those who settle on a different God who was opposed to the God of the Jews, and that from this different God, the Son, namely the different Son of God, has come. Reportedly, Marcionites departed from the Creator as an inferior being and have gone to a God whom they regard as superior, who is the Father of Jesus who came to earth. This is basically accurate Marcionite teaching. But then Celsus used anti-Marcionite arguments that he must have overheard from incipient Catholics of his day. For instance, he understood the Marcionites to say that God sent his Son to destroy the Creator's works, and he then accused the Marcionite Jesus of acting in the manner of a secret agent to lead and deceive people into following another way of life. Celsus emphasizes the mercy of the Marcionite great God, who is said to desire the sinners and riffraff who were condemned by the Creator. These people are even called pieces of shit. In this view, Christ cajoled people who were condemned and cursed by the Creator and led them away like escaped slaves. This viewpoint assumes that the Creator of this world is the master and father of all human beings, and that Christ stole them away from their slave master, the Creator, adopting them so that they belong to the true God, but without obtaining the consent of their actual father. In fact, there was something, however, that Christ rightfully claimed to recover from the Creator, and that was the divine spirit of the great God. This spirit was sent into the world in order to inhabit human beings. It is the true essence of humanity and does not belong to the Creator. Critiquing this position, Celsus wondered why the great God would ever give his spirit in the first place to a creator whom he knew was wicked. Assuming that God gave the spirit to the creator, it also makes no sense for God to demand back what he gave. Demanding back, says Celsus, indicates that God is lacking something, which is impossible. Now, there are several elements in this portrayal of Marcionite teaching that are not accurate. Perhaps Celsus confused Marcionites with Gnostics or Sethians when he imagined that God gave his spirit to the Creator. In fact, God gave his spirit to humanity as a gift, not to the Creator specifically, and he didn't demand it back from the Creator. He rather reclaimed what was his own. The Creator had wrongfully gained control of spirit-endowed humans and devised, quote-unquote, other phenomena against the great God and against his spirit, to entrap humanity and to imprison them in his lower cosmos. Therefore, the great God had to send his Son to fight the Creator. Now, the Creator also has his Son, identified with the Messiah of the Jews, who actually fulfills Jewish prophecy. Using a healthy dose of imagination, Celsus invented an imaginary battle between the two different sons of the two different gods. I see them now, he said, gladiators in single combat, fighting like quails, and their fathers fight in a battle of the gods. Or have these fathers become useless and senile with age, unable to reach an agreement with each other unless their children do battle? This is a case where Celsus's desire to raise a laugh does end up distorting Christian teaching. Marcionites, for their part, never imagined the true Christ as living at the same time as the Messiah of the Creator. The Messiah of the Creator, who is the Redeemer of the Jews, had not yet come. Thus, he could not do battle with Jesus, at least not directly during his lifetime. When he was on earth, Jesus did have a superhuman opponent, the Creator himself. Despite the fact that the Creator managed to have Jesus crucified, Jesus was able to triumph over him by a ruse, since he could defeat death itself. And I say much more about this in my book, The Evil Creator. Finally, Celsus is the only source we know of who transmit what seems originally to have been a Marcionite charge against those Christians who corrupted their gospel. In his speech of the Jew, Celsus accused some Christians of taking it upon themselves to debase the gospel from its first composition into a threefold, fourfold, and manifold composition, and to counterfeit material so that they have the means to deny the refutations of their critics. Origen commented on this remark that I don't know of any debasers of the gospel other than the followers of Marcion and Valentinus. I suspect also Lucanus's followers, Lucanus being another Marcionite. In short, Origen knew that Celsus was informed by Marcionite arguments. It is thus reasonable to hypothesize that Celsus's critique of gospel corruption adapts yet another Marcionite charge, for Origen immediately thought of Marcionites when he read it, using a charge he knew was Marcionite in the first place, but now against the Marcionites themselves. If this hypothesis is correct, the metaphor of gospel corruption employed here presumes that the Marcionite gospel was the original coin, stamped with the true image of Christ, as it were, and that the other three Gospels would evidently refer to Gospels according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to John. The four Gospels would apparently be these three, plus the one according to Luke. And by the later 2nd century, Marcionites were aware of still more Gospels, so they logically included a reference to more. Celsus's Marcionites apparently assumed that all other Gospels were created on the basis of their original Gospel. The four Gospels in particular were like coins, with the face, the original image, defaced and replaced with a false sign, similar to the example of Irenaeus, who spoke of a mosaic depicting a king rearranged to look like a fox. Marcion and his followers proposed that these other Gospels had been created or edited for apologetic reasons, that is, to deal with the objections that cropped up over the years as Christianity began to make inroads. But they also included some purely invented material, for Tertullian mentions that Marcionites accused the Catholics or incipient Catholics of inventing a Christ for themselves. For Marcionites, any material not in their original gospel was probably seen as invented or fictional to some degree. Regardless of the apologetic aims of the four gospels, to deflect external criticism, the Marcionite theory isn't actually far off from modern notions. In a recent book, a Jesuit professor emeritus of the Biblical Institute of Rome, Jean-Noel Aletti, concludes that Luke's abundant repetition of biblical phraseology and models is the means by which he shows that Jesus' message is in complete continuity with the holy books of Israel, and that by affirming that Jesus fulfilled the biblical books, he indirectly responds, that is, Luke indirectly responds to outsiders who accuse the Jesus movement of being a newfangled cult. The critics of Christianity, as we know, did attack Christianity by saying, in a nutshell, that the cult of Christ appeared out of nowhere, not sufficiently rooted in ancient tradition. Accordingly, later gospel revisions, including canonical Luke, took greater care to root Christianity more deeply in the long and respected Jewish tradition, which they appropriated. Thus, according to Marcionites, Luke is demonstrably later because it is more apologetically oriented and born out of a desire to answer second century objections against Christian novelty. To conclude, regardless of his inaccuracies in pejorative language, Celsus is an important and unique source revealing second century Christian diversity. He's a window into the kinds of Christian groups who thrived in Alexandria and elsewhere in the empire. Of course, Celsus wanted to emphasize Christian disagreement in order to prove that Christian claims were false and that they had devolved from an original unity. From Celsus's point of view, factionalism was built into the fiber of the Christian soul, thus it's no wonder why they formed so many distinct groups. Celsus exaggerated when he said that Christians share nothing in common except their name, but there's at least a hint of truth in his remark about the rancor and malignity of inner Christian debate. Those most fiercely opposed to each other are those who are most alike, and in particular those trying to make truth claims and to compete for converts in the same playing field. There is one thing that united Christians, said Celsus, their opposition to Judaism. And when Celsus wore the mask of his Jewish critic of Christianity, he assumed that Christians who convince a great number of people belong to an opposing, that is, non-Jewish party. And yet, even here, the Christian opposition to Judaism was probably not entirely uniform, since Celsus mentions Christians who attempted to follow Jewish customs and Marcionite Christians who, by and large, did not give a fig for Judaism and thus had nothing to criticize. It appears that from the very beginning, Christian diversity has in some ways been irreducible. In history, as we know, some things change, but larger patterns remain the same.